The primary thing I think that we're all seeing in the last 7-ish days worth of headlines is the conflict between Israel and Iran. And we all know the kind of dance steps here. Israel launched airstrikes, Iran launched rockets, Israel continued with weakening air defenses, attacking nuclear sites, brought in the United States, asking the United States for help with a very specific piece of ordnance, a bunker buster that was strong enough to go into some of the most secure nuclear facilities, to which Donald Trump ultimately said yes, and then ran a very successful bombing raid, and then called for a ceasefire between both Iran and Israel. So those kind of major steps are things that we all understand. I think one of the things that people aren't really recognizing or aren't considering is the fact that both Israel and the United States took preemptive action on Iran. Iran had not taken any kind of aggression or aggressive actions to cause those initial preemptive strikes. And the United States has a pretty strict no first strike policy. We don't make the first strike. We try to give countries an opportunity to reach diplomatic ends before we go and execute with our military, understanding that we have the world's most sophisticated, most well-funded military out there. So it was very, very different, very unique in terms of how this whole thing played out. And the Israeli-Iranian conflict appears to be new to people, even though we've been watching Israel systematically degrade Iran ever since the October 7th attacks that came from Hamas. So you can really start to see the lack of understanding, the lack of familiarity people have with how Iran executes its conflict and how justified Israel is in taking the actions that they're taking.
Well, that has been fascinating because Francis and I by no means consider ourselves experts, but because of the people we've had on the show, yourself included, like we've had people, we actually put a video out basically showing off and saying, we told you so, because we had people predicting this was going to happen for months and months ahead of time. But you're right. I think the media narrative is so reactive. People are, oh, this thing happened. And then suddenly like people are, oh, why did it happen? And sometimes, but the question I wanted to ask you is, first of all, you mentioned that this action was unique. And the question obviously then is, why do you think President Trump made the decision to go in with the bunker busters on that preemptive basis? Because would I be right in saying that it would also be your opinion that while Iran was enriching uranium way beyond civilian use, they did not have like a nuclear bomb with the thing attached on a rocket launcher ready to go, right?
Exactly right. And that's the thing that's some of the nuance that, in my opinion, isn't very nuanced. That's pretty significant,
right?
There's a difference between having uranium enriched to 90% versus having uranium weaponized for detonation on the end of a delivery vehicle that can be launched anywhere worldwide. Right? I mean, we saw this when Russia launched an ICBM, a non-nuclear tipped ICBM, in a counterstrike against Ukraine. An intercontinental ballistic missile, a missile that can launch itself into the stratosphere and then deliver a payload from space, is a terrifying weapon without a nuclear warhead. But it's years away from out of reach for Iran to be able to create both the weapons grade uranium and the delivery vehicle that can't be intercepted.
Really? Years away?
Because it takes right now, there are 0 ICBMs in the Iranian inventory. They have medium range ballistic missiles.
Right.
Those are the same
so
missiles.
That's enough to nuke Israel, right? If they had a nuclear warhead ready to go.
And if Israel didn't intercept the missile.
But ballistic missiles are notoriously difficult to intercept, are they not?
I mean, except for the fact that they've been getting shot down by both U.S. and Israeli forces now at a rate of 80% or more. So not notoriously difficult. There's always room for them to get through, right? But now if you think about it, a barrage of 100 missiles, we've been seeing barrages of missiles anywhere from 30 to 120 from Iran at any given time, of which 2 to 5 get through. Well, if that 2 to 5 happens to be nuclear tipped, then yes, you've got a problem.
Right.
But the odds are they're not going to be. The odds are that they would launch one in a battery of 50 or so others, of which the majority would be intercepted. So now you're playing a probability game.
But you can see why Israel wouldn't want to take that chance, right?
It makes total sense that Israel wants to take 0 chances with a threat that is hell-bent on their eradication, right?
So come back to my question about why you think Trump did this.
I mean, honestly, I think Trump did this because he was looking for a victory. I think Trump was looking for a political victory in a landscape of recent failures that were mounting when his entire political campaign, his whole political promise was on being the person who would end Israel-Hamas, the person who would end Ukraine, Russia, the person who would kind of bring back American jobs through tariffs, and just systematically he was losing and losing and losing, and he needed a victory. I think Netanyahu understood that too, and he gave him kind of an open plate to say, hey, we took out the air defenses, we shut down their air force, we have air superiority. All you have to do is fly in a bunch of high-tech stealth bombers and drop a couple of bombs.
That is so interesting that you make that point, because I had a debate with Dave Smith on Piers Morgan's show, and I kind of said, they were like, well, how do you think this is going to play? I was like, well, Americans love winning and they love bombing shit. So like, this has the potential, if it goes the right way, to be a huge political win for President Trump.
And that's all it is.
Really?
That's all it is. I mean, the narrative coming out of the United States right now is completely backwards and upside down. Trump has created a cabinet of people who are loyal to Trump. So they're not going to disagree with him. You saw that with Tulsi Gabbard when she said on the first committee that Iran was not close to making a nuclear weapon, and then a week later she completely changed her stance. Right? That's the team that Trump has built, is this team of people that will do what he says he wants them to do. They're protecting their reputation more than anything else. There's a very clear theorem when you go to a war college, when you go to an army war college or an air war college, and there's these competing ideas of limited war versus total war. If I'm taking you down a road that you've heard before, please interrupt.
No, carry on.
We have learned, the United States has learned all the way back through Vietnam and Korea, that limited war doesn't work. You don't win a limited war. And a limited war is a war with limited objectives. You can only really win a total war. And a total war means you are fully committed to destroying your enemy and resetting their capability. That's what World War II was. That's what Israel is launching against Iran in many ways. They want a total war, right? There's some limitations that make that difficult for them. What Trump did by sending in B-2 bombers to destroy 3 major well-known, Iranian enrichment sites was a limited war move. There's no strategic long-term benefit that comes from that. Because especially now that what we're seeing in headlines now is that the enriched uranium was possibly moved out of that location before the attack came. That's a perfect example of the problem with limited war.
Andrew, there'll be people saying, well, hang on a second, I take your point, but what Trump was doing was an actual show of strength to the Iranians to say, look, get in line, get behind the table, or this is going to happen again.
I don't disagree that it was an attempted show of strength, but instead I think all he really did was make the Ayatollah look stronger. I think America's move into Iran made it look like we have fancier technology, and even with our better weapons, and even with our better missiles, and even with the full fighting force of Israel and the United States, Iran still has the capability to enrich uranium. They still have enriched uranium, and now more than ever, they have justifiable cause to go to their friends, North Korea, Russia, China, and get the additional weaponry and the additional technology they need to put that combustible warhead on a delivery vehicle.
But Russia have been actually pretty non-committal when it's come to this. I mean, let's be honest. So we've got Putin, he's got his hands full with Ukraine. You look at Xi, I mean, they've condemned it, but there's nothing else has really come from the Chinese. Do they really care about this? They've got their eyes on Taiwan, surely.
So I think what we're seeing is the public side of diplomacy, not the actual side of diplomacy. You've heard of like the bat phones and the backroom deals and the phone calls that don't get recorded. I mean, those are very important things. And having Putin and Xi Jinping not say outwardly that they support Iran does not mean that they do not support Iran in some other way, right? Iran is the breadbasket of the Middle East, and that's something that often gets overlooked. Without Iran, Saudi Arabia doesn't eat. Without Iran, UAE doesn't have fresh vegetables. Even though they have a hostile stance against the policy of the formal government, they still have a carve-out for trade, just like the United States still has a carve-out for Russia, right? Even though we have all these sanctions on Russia, and even though we claim that Russia is evil and we don't support them and we want the rest of the world not to support them, we still have carve-outs because we still want Russian cosmonauts and we still want their help in space. So there's all these policy carve-outs, and the same thing exists in the Middle East. Inside those carve-outs, that's where Iran really has the most leverage. So if Iran makes a backroom deal with China and says, hey, we're going to keep producing agriculture, but we want you to buy it, and then we'll shut off trade to the Middle East. So we'll make them starve. We'll make them pay more money for their basic needs in food because they're going to have to import that from the United States since Ukraine can't feed them either. right? So there's still options on the table for Iran to cause a lot of pain in its sphere of influence.
CIA believes that all people are born with a spy secret superpower. For some people, that means they can win deals. For others, they can spot liars. Some can even seduce lovers. I built a free 3-minute test to help reveal to you exactly what your secret hidden superpower is. All you have to do is click on the link in the description below, take the test, and start using your spy superpower to stay ahead of 99% of people.
Because there's a lot of people talking about regime change. And this, this is the first step in regime change. Obviously, Israel wants regime change. It's not, how can I put it, optimal to have your neighbor calling you a cancer and saying you should be wiped off the face of the earth. But what's the appetite for regime change? Because although the Ayatollah is who he is, there's always a risk that, number one, you're going to get someone far worse. And number two, what could actually happen is in the case of Iraq, when it descends into civil war.
Correct. And these are lessons that the United States has learned, which is another reason why this bombing into Iran was such a faux pas when it comes to strategic military intention, which is probably what happens when you don't have professionals at the helm in the cabinet, right? When the United States has learned that regime change at the force of an external enemy oftentimes doesn't result in a democratic leader being elected. It results in the next strongest or even stronger kind of hawkish leader being elected. And that's true in transnational threats like terrorist groups or cartels, and it's true in governments as well. So if the Ayatollah were to fall, there's a good chance whoever comes in his place is going to be worse, to your point. If the Ayatollah falls and the whole country descends into civil war, a la Syria, a la Libya, now we've just lost a very important element to the survival of the Middle East because the entire country is going to descend into something worse. I think the other thing that's important to note is that there's a difference between what the West is telling the West about Iran versus what it actually looks like in Iran. Most Iranians don't really like being under a theocracy, but they would for sure like it worse to be under an Israeli shadow government or an Israeli puppet government, right? Remember when all the stories came out after Russia invaded Ukraine and it didn't work very quickly, and then everybody was like, oh, there's gonna be regime change in Russia.
No, that was only dumb people saying that, with all respect.
But it was all over the headlines,
Yeah.
right? We may be in the same place right now, right? Where the headlines are saying one thing, vocalized by dumb people, because it's a very clickable headline. I remember when Putin had brain cancer. Remember that too? I mean, all this shit came out because there's so much appetite to just say something instead of admit how little we really know.
Well, speaking of that, you mentioned the fact that these strikes may not have been as effective as people have been claiming. And Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, she came out commenting on the story, I think it was published by CNN and the New York Times, suggesting that the strikes didn't fully eliminate Iran's nuclear enrichment program. And she simultaneously said two things that can't be true at once, which is she said, these are leaks and the person who leaked them is evil, and also it's bullshit by a journalist who's not telling the truth. And you're going, well, it's either a leak or it's bullshit.
Yeah, it's not real.
So what's you keep mentioning that you don't think they were effective. What are you saying and why?
So there's a couple of things. I'm seeing the same thing you're saying. So I am coming to an assessment based off of what I'm seeing in open source, right? That's the terminology I would use at CIA is I'm reaching an assessment based on open source knowledge that's available to us at the time. You have formal statements coming from the US federal government that don't make sense and are contradictory, right? You have totally obliterated targets, and then also people saying that there are leaks, and then the leaks are saying something that's different than an obliterated target, and then you have this idea that maybe they're not leaks at all, they're just totally fabricated, right? Total fabrications. You can't make sense out of those different streams of information. So somewhere in there is something true, but most of what you're seeing is something that's kind of covered up. And then at the same time, there's long been known reports in public databases that Iran doesn't keep their highly enriched uranium at the same facility where they keep the centrifuges, because they've learned this is fairly common when it comes to creating any inventory. Once your inventory is built, you relocate the inventory into a deeper bunker, someplace that's more secure, someplace that's more secret. So even if we assume that the White House is telling us the truth, which it has no incentive to do, even if we assume that the White House is telling us the truth, that all 3 locations were totally eliminated, all centrifuges are down, they have no capacity to enrich uranium any further, then all of their previously 60% enriched uranium from the last 3 years, 2 years, that has been moved to another location that we didn't bomb, unless we bombed a secret location that nobody is talking about.
Well, here's the question I have over that, which is, I mean, Mossad seems to, like, every second Iranian seems to work for Mossad at this point. Like, they're deep in there. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely.
So wouldn't they know if that had happened?
This is part of why I think that Israel is playing a very smart game here.
Okay.
Because Israel chose a conflict against Iran, which is basically the only country in the world that Israel could choose to execute first strike on and have almost full support, even though it wouldn't be stated support, from all of the members of the Khaliji Arab states, as well as all the Western states.
Flesh that out a little bit, Andrew, because most people think that, oh, like, you know, the Middle East, all the Muslims hate Israel. It's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially you have two, if you take away everybody in the world except for oil countries, just erase them from your mind for a second, and you have 2 competing spheres of influence. You have Iran, which represents Shia Islam and is an oil country, and then you have Saudi Arabia, which represents Sunni Islam and is an oil-rich country. Outside of the rest of the world, these 2 countries have been in conflict for decades. Regional conflict, ideological conflict, geographical military conflict. Saudi Arabia's number 1 enemy is Iran. Iran's number 1 enemy is Saudi Arabia. Now when you layer in everything else, then you see the larger landscape. We're all just we're side dishes to their main course, right? So the United States talks a big game about Iran, but Iran doesn't sit around talking a big game about the United States. Iran sits around making a big deal out of Saudi Arabia because they're trying to build what's known as the Shia Crescent. They're trying to bring back Shia Islam as a major religion, as a major power player, a theological, political power player in their region. That's the main goal of Iran.